I was with a friend last night, and he asked me what I was going to talk about, and I said, well, I really don't know, because if I start thinking about it now, I might get bored. So I guarantee you I'm not bored. I also asked if he might pray for me at this precise moment or 10 minutes before this, and he said no, he thought it'd be more appropriate if he prayed for the audience. So I guarantee you there's somebody on your side. And then the final put down was when I walked in and George Petrosky came up to me and he said, I'm going to put a certain tape on if you'll talk less than an hour. So I think George was trying to tell me something on your behalf. I would hope that at the conclusion of my remarks that you'll turn the tables on the legal profession. We usually dish it out. We usually cross-examine you on the stand, so I hope you'll do just that to me. And we mean that very sincerely. So I went to bed last night not knowing how I would be used today as a conduit, and I can tell you at 7:15 this morning I found out. And I think that might be helpful to all of us if I explain to you what happened when the phone rang at 7:15. The president of an extremely large and successful corporation in the United States called me, and I knew his family and I knew his children, and I had never met him, although I felt I had. And he said to me, I'm really sorry to wake you up at 7:15, and that he had. But he said, my daughter is in the Middletown Township Police Station and she's been arrested. And then he went on to the reasons which I cannot impart to you at this point. And he said, I'm about to leave for Europe today on an extremely important business trip. Now, I jumped to a psychological set because at that moment I would have thought, he's going to Europe, here's my family garbage, and you take care of it. But, much to my surprise and delight, his next comment was, I'm leaving in 5 minutes to come to Bucks County. And will you help? And that was beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous. It was all said because his priorities were in place. And I can guarantee you the number of families that I deal with where their priorities are so totally out of whack, it isn't funny. That was today a message to me to bring to you. And if I say nothing else today, I think it's categorizing your own priorities in your own life and in your own family. And then at 9 o'clock this morning, 26 of us, including Dr. Peters sitting out in the audience, and some extremely well-meaning, and I might say present company excluded, rather bright, incisive people, we're putting together a preliminary report for the county commissioners that we've worked on for 6 months in terms of a redirection of the human services priorities in this county. And what we were really talking about was how can government do it for you? How can they solve your drug and alcohol, your family problems, the divorce issues, the mental health issues, children and youth, and on and on. And I think in that room I realized how tragic it was. How tragic it was that we were there. Because what we were in effect saying, government is doing it for you, and government is doing it badly. And I think we have to come to that stark realization. Because if you go back historically, when the concept of community really meant something, government really didn't do it for you. The school district really didn't do it for you. The community did it for each other. The church as we knew it was the frontline human service delivery system. If a house burnt down, who rebuilt it? The community. If you were in trouble, if there were elderly that needed help, the community did it. The church did it. And oddly enough, one of the studies we looked at was Scotland. In Scotland, they have what they call human services wardens. They're street wardens. They find out what people need, how they need it, what the most effective delivery system will be, and then they go out into the community and get volunteers and do it. And I suggest to you that Jesus Focus does that upon occasion, and I think it's a challenge for the 80s that they ever broaden that concept. Because what we used to do historically in the 70s in this county and in this country, when we had a problem, we threw money at it. We didn't necessarily solve it. We just deluged it with dollars. Now, what's happened very recently, because of Proposition 13 coming east from California, we can no longer do that. So what we're going to have to do, I suggest, is deal with some of the root causes. Yesterday afternoon, since I thought I ought to talk about a little law, I'm going to talk about a very little law. And that's the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And I first opened the Pennsylvania Constitution and I read a couple of phrases that I think are absolutely amazing at this time in history. But if you go back to the time that this was written by our forefathers, they said in 3 lines in the preamble, "We, the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, grateful to Almighty God for the blessings of civil and religious liberty, and humbly invoking His guidance, do ordain and establish this Constitution." And then they drop down to Section 3, religious freedom. And they start by saying to all of us, "All men have a natural and indefeasible right to worship Almighty God according to the dictates of their own conscience." The element of free will. That's amazing. That's what our forefathers told us that law, government, should be directed from and applied to the people of this Commonwealth. And oddly enough, our forefathers in Philadelphia in 1776 in the Declaration of Independence said very much the same, with concepts such as endowed by their Creator and on the protection of divine providence. I would suggest to you, as I view it, that laws, courts, legislature, and people in large measure have totally lost sight of those concepts. That if you look at our system as applied to all of us today, it's very much on a humanistic basis. When it gets to the actual seat of government, when it gets to the Vice President of the United States, and I think we have really got to take a very strong look at the foundation of the basis of this country. And I think you find it in the preamble of the Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania. The subject that I'm supposed to speak on, and maybe I will touch on it at times, is the lawyer's role in the family and the legal aspect of marriage. The lawyer's role in many instances in the family, as far as I'm concerned, is to get fired. And that's rather unique, but I said that to many clients when they walk in for the first time, especially in a family or a domestic problem. The quicker that I can get out of your life, the quicker that I can get fired, and that you can get on with the meaning of your very existence, the better it will be for you. Because the impact of the system, the legal, the governmental system, in large measure, I must admit to you, is rather negative. I heard the other day somebody say, well, with this new divorce code, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, I guess you have to plan for divorce. I guess you do. When over 50% of the people that are married are getting divorced today, and a conference of Roman Catholic bishops in the newspapers are telling us things as they did last night in the Daily Intelligence, sir. Pre-marriage waiting period considered. As you probably know, and I understand that about 42.5% of the crowd are Roman Catholics, is that right? You didn't. He had all the other statistics. He didn't have that one. When there is in this diocese, in most dioceses, a 3-week waiting period where they announce the bans of marriage, the Roman Catholic bishops are now saying, we think we should make this much longer. But not only longer, meaningful. And something that a number of us have said for years in the legal profession, we should make it much more difficult to get married and easier to get divorced. But I think what we're really saying in a very positive vein, that if the churches would step back into the role that they had and have abdicated, that I think their parishioners and mankind would have a better chance of getting on with the daily concept of living. That is, that if it was a requirement to really challenge the potential couple on their Christian values, on the concept and meaning of marriage and family. There are very few schools today that really teach a course in human living, that teach about the family. And I think that this is one of the basic concepts that I think will help to put the domestic relations lawyers out of business. And I think that would be a very positive step in the right direction. How do we do that? How could this ministry step forward and take up that gauntlet? I think it's very simple. I think that this ministry, for instance, could be a pilot project to take young people that are about to enter into the sea of matrimony and set up and tap the resources within this ministry of having a training program for them so that it will strengthen their potential marriage, their potential family, and their community. One of the other difficulties, of course, is that in our ever-moving society, we don't even know what the community is anymore. People are uprooted every 3 years or 5 years or whatever. And so we have had to recognize uniform acts in child custody, uniform acts in support and in divorce, because they have to be applicable in multi states. I have a case right now where my client is being divorced in Kansas, but the children live in Pennsylvania and all the property is here. And a Kansas judge is having to make decisions about what happens in upstate Pennsylvania. And that's norm today. That's not unusual at all. So that I think part of the difficulty when I said that the church served the community is fluid, ever expansive, and one that's almost like a piece of silly putty squeezing through your fingers. So it's an ever increasing challenge to the community as we know it. I think scripturally, what we have to look at is Matthew 23, 25 through 28. It's a phrase in there that has many interpretations. You are so careful to polish the outside of the cup, but the inside is foul. We are so cautious about what other people think about us, what our public actions are. But so often, for instance, Paul Henry and I will see in the drug treatment program that we're involved in, there are many parents that would rather admit that their children have cancer of the bubonic plague than a drug addiction, because they feel guilt and fault in that they had goofed as parents, when in reality that might not be the case at all. A shocking statistic came to me yesterday. How many hours a week does the average husband and wife communicate, speak to each other in the United States? How many hours a week? Anybody have a wild guess? What's your wild guess?
1 hour.
15 minutes a week. And that's probably to determine which television shows they're going to watch, or dispute over the fact they don't like the one the other one's watching, okay? But that certainly tells us a loud and clear message. Because what we're finding, those of us that are on the front lines of the family that is up for grabs, and I can tell you that family unit as we know it is up for grabs. When you have a 50% divorce rate, when you have 500,000 children per year, teenage children leaving their homes because they just can't make it there. They can't function in the family setting. And then you look, for instance, to the Mennonite and the Amish community, and we find little or no drug abuse. We find not a tremendous upheaval within those kind of communities. There certainly is a message. Well, we'll all get back to the horse and buggy because of the cost of gas, and that's not the message, I might add. But what we're finding is new root causes for the destruction of the family. And it's odd, but the other day when Paul Henry and Richard and I were sitting at lunch, we were talking about these root causes. What do you see new? And we all sort of came to the same conclusions. And that is, contrary to 10 or 15 years ago, we're seeing, for instance, the basic root causes of destruction of the family. Issues like fundamental differences in the rearing of children, the women's lib movement, male menopause, and the lack of communication. Now, what do all those crazy concepts mean? Well, let's take the easy one. And if I start describing these, and 10 of you get up and walk out and say, "Oh my God, that's my husband or wife," please don't do it. Because I must admit, in these few moments, I am simplifying the issues. A lot of parents today, and I bet you Paul Henry said something very close to this, feel that their function as a parent is to be their child's best friend. And that is absolutely ridiculous and asinine. That is not your function on this planet. You certainly have a function of being a role model and a directive force, because I think we would candidly admit that many children are parrots of what they see and the image that you create. And if, for instance, you're going to cheat in your own income tax, and when the phone rings, you're going to say to your child, "Tell them I'm not here." And they're just little white lies, and they're expected of all of us. But they should be role models in their society of absolute perfection. The inconsistency just doesn't work. But what happens within the family is that so often you will have a disagreement on the basic authority of the family over the children. I suggest to you, if you're going to have those disagreements, have them in the bedroom with the door closed and the kids miles away. Battle it out there and then come out as a unified effort, right or wrong. We're so fearful of being wrong. We are mere mortals, and we should never lose sight of that. Now, the women's lib movement, and maybe there's a contrary men's lib movement that is going in our society now, really has threatened and challenged the family as we've known it. Because what I hear 3 and 4 times a week, I've got to find myself. I've got to seek my real identity. The family is a chokehold, is a yoke around my neck. And they really do not work at it, but walk away from it. And I think the male is counter-reacting to that, and maybe rightfully so. And then we go through this so-called concept of male menopause. And I sometimes can describe it. It happens usually in the 30s or 40s. And they might take up tennis or racquetball, change their hairdo, lose weight like Richard did. But then they get a girlfriend. And then the destruction is upon us. And this is quite apparent. And then the concept of lack of communication. You hear it between spouses, parents and spouses, between children, siblings, whatever. Family we know very well does not have a television in their house. They read a great deal and they discuss a great deal. Now, I happen to represent an electronics company that distributes televisions, so don't ever go out of this room and say, I said get rid of your televisions. But certainly there's got to be some meaningful communications time within a family. There've got to be issues that you can discuss. You can't just pass each other in the hallway. And when I said to you that frightening example that husbands and wives communicate about 15 minutes a week, that's the stark reality. How can you communicate when you don't talk? The Braille system is not terribly effective for those who can see. The other thing that we're seeing rather constantly, and there are some generalizations I think we can make, and that is that the divorce rate, you can break it down into age categories. You see the very new marriages in the teens and the 20s. It's the so-called Hollywood marriage. If it doesn't work, I'll just split. I really don't have to work at it. I can get a divorce because nobody is going to embrand a D on my forehead, and I'll take up with somebody else. I'll go live with someone else. Happens absolutely constantly. In the 30s, we get the concept of not only male menopause, but I think a great deal of the women's lib movement, counter-reacting against each other and trying to go out and seek a new life. But then the interesting and tragic concept is that if you're divorced once, the likelihood is you're going to be divorced twice and 3 times, or you're just going to live with somebody. You're never really going to deal with the root causes of why the family came unglued the first time. And then in the 40s, there is a different challenge, and that is the total change of your role. Where oftentimes, for instance, a woman, her children go off to college or off to work, and she doesn't feel as needed, and she starts to negatively react, and she thinks her life is over. And then her husband's reaction will be totally negative. And then the relationship tragically comes unglued. Now the role of the lawyer. We'll finally get to that. Into our office come all of these people in different sizes and different shapes and in different emotional upheaval. And what is our role? Well, Paul Henry and I have debated this many, many times, but I think our initial role is mental health. I think our initial role is to try to seek out the root cause by listening very, very carefully, because very few of us listen carefully. It's oftentimes, it's not what somebody says, it's what they don't say. If you are a trained listener, sometimes in 15 minutes you can find out what the problem is by what somebody didn't say. And then you can never say that every marital or every family situation is the same. I've never seen 2 in my professional lifetime alike. They're all different. And if we start treating them the same, we're in trouble. And we do this as a society. We have all these alphabet agencies for mental health, mental retardation, etc. We don't even initially identify the problem. We just spit them into the system. It's like some lawyers I know, they assume that every time somebody walks into their office, they're there to have their family broken up, and they start through the process and they get them divorced. They really don't ask very many questions. I think that's inherently wrong. I think that's a human tragedy. I think the first effort we must make, whether you be a minister, a counselor, a lawyer, a doctor, and they're the people that are seeing them on the front lines, you've got to first try and analyze the problem, and if you can't, then get them to the right kind of help. And you don't send all the people to the same place. Paul Henry is an excellent marriage counselor. That's your ad, and that's the only one I'm going to give you, okay? But if it's a very serious psychiatric problem, it's unfair to send that person to Paul because that's not his background. And I dare say that if Paul saw that kind of issue, he'd ship them out quickly. But if they do have some religious background and they do have some Christian principles, maybe they're lurking way out there in the dark, then Paul can be very effective. In other instances, you will have to refer them to a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But pick and choose your professionals very carefully. Just because somebody's got a shingle out, or just because you met them at a social gathering, don't necessarily use them. Check them out with as many credible people and agencies as you can, and when the same name comes back 2 or 3 times, you at least know you're on the right track. Because I can guarantee you that there are a lot of so-called counselors that are stark raving mad, that they're in the business to try to vent their own spleen and solve their own problems, and what they do to some of the people that walk into their office is a human tragedy in and of itself. So that I see so often the general public thinks just because somebody has a shingle out that they can be effective. Not true in any sense of the word. And if that's the only message I give you today, take that one home also. I think it's so important that we understand that when divorce is in the offing, how many people it can affect within the same family or the same community. It obviously affects the children. It obviously affects the grandparents. And it affects the friends. They said in Vietnam, when one person got wounded, it took 3 to 4 of the troops out of action. In one divorce case, it can take many more than 3 or 4 troops out of action. And the other problem so often is that as grandparents, friends, or relatives, without knowing all the facts, you will jump in and try to help. And sometimes your help is an absolute tragedy. I think the best thing you can do is to listen, to be a strong shoulder, and if you see a mental health problem, try to get them some help. And there are a lot of doors that you can open for them. But don't jump into the combat, because oftentimes a domestic relations situation is on the brink of being World War III. And we are combatants. We do inherently take sides. And I think we only inflame the situation. And we see it so ever constantly. And then you might be caught up in this situation whereby all of a sudden they get back together again, and you're the mother or the father of one of the spouses, and then you're the odd man out. And that the only way that they can survive or function in the rehabilitative situation that they find them is to exclude you. And then you've really done a number on yourself. And I've seen it happen to many parents and many grandparents. So that certainly is a time of caution. Now, going back to the Pennsylvania Constitution that had a preamble based on a fundamental commitment to God, I think oddly enough, the new divorce code that our legislature passed and became effective on July 2, 1980. And there it is, it's called House Bill 640, and you've read a lot about it, and an awful lot of what you read is probably wrong, because the people that wrote about it really didn't understand what it was, in all frankness. The first thing it is a recognition that the divorce code in Pennsylvania was so archaic it wasn't funny. It was last amended before this new act in 1929. And it was first written in the late 1700s. And not much happened to it from about 1784 until 1929. And nothing happened to our divorce code until this year. And as I said earlier, many people will say you better plan to get divorced when you get married. That's not what the legislature said in this act. They started out in the legislative findings and intent and said the family is the basic unit in society. Protection and preservation of the family is of paramount public concern. And they went on from there. They did recognize, however, that if there is going to be discord, dissolution, and destruction of the family, the following: to effect economic justice between parties who are divorced or separated, and that's the key to this act. I find it the fairest act that we have in this country, with maybe rare exception. It's not community property such as California, where you split everything down the middle. It's equitable distribution. And that's just exactly what it means, to be fair, to be equitable when you take in property settlements 10 standards and in alimony 14 standards. Pennsylvania is not going to reinvent the wheel and have to create entirely new law, because there's Kentucky and Delaware and New Jersey that have lived with the same kind of legislation for a long time. The important thing is that if the parties can't reach a settlement, there are now standards that a judge or an administrative system can apply. Unique things that didn't exist. Like if a gal is a nurse and she educates her husband, becomes a doctor, and then he meets a new gal and discards her, that's going to be taken into account. And in a Delaware case, with just exactly those facts, she was given 80% of the property. Because the court said she educated him, she worked, and then she was discarded. New Jersey said, in a case with a great deal of money in it, that a housewife is worth economically $40,000 a year. Did you realize your value? And that is 100. That is as a travel agent, a homemaker, a taxi cab driver, a nutritionist, and on and on and on. But in that case, her husband made $80,000 a year. I dare say if somebody's making $12,000 a year, a court's not going to say in that setting economically that the wife is worth $40,000 a year and divide it up that way. I use some of these way out examples to show you that there is an ability to be fair. Pennsylvania, prior to this act, was a male chauvinistic state in terms of divorce and economic distribution. Very simply, why? The legislature was predominantly male, the courts were predominantly male, and they were protecting their own flanks. I think you realize that politicians' marriages are often up for grabs, especially what we're seeing in the Abscan investigations of late. But all of a sudden, there was enough public outcry and enough public pressure to say that we've got to be inherently and fundamentally fair. Now, no question that there were some of the pressure groups that worked at loggerheads, sometimes in conjunction with each other, and we came out with this type of legislation. And this might be the most encouraging thing that's happened in a long time in the state of Pennsylvania. And yes, the Bible Belt, the Roman Catholic Church took very strong positions. There is, for instance, only one other state in the United States that recognizes as an issue in alimony fault, marital fault, besides Pennsylvania. And the Roman Catholic Church said, we will not support this unless that becomes an issue. And it was an issue. The Bible Belt, the upper part of the state of Pennsylvania, as we call it, and the Church, Roman Catholic Church, also took the position that if there's going to be a unilateral, and namely a one-sided divorce, we want the longest waiting period in the state of Pennsylvania, the longest of any place in the country, and that's 3 years. Right or wrong, I think we're going to find out what that is ultimately going to mean. I could take either side of that issue, but I just want you to know that although we constantly hear about separation of church and state, it cannot be a reality. When we are going to legislate human values and human morals, the church must take a stand. And I think that that is categorically true. No matter how you feel about the moral majority, whether they were right or wrong, at least it was a step where Christians stood out and said, we will no longer stand idly by and let certain things happen governmentally, legislatively, and intellectually. We have a lot to learn because this is a new concept for all of us. And I think that this is a fundamental learning period. But I would challenge this ministry that I think in the field of human services, human needs, that if we can become stronger listeners, stronger supporters of our fellow man, less likely to criticize until we have all the facts, then I think our daily Christian walk will be substantially enhanced. And now it's your chance. Thank you.
You're going to walk away with it. Not amplifying? Question, we want you to raise your hand, and then if you have it for a specific person on the panel to say so. If it's a general question, don't define, and I'll give it to one of the others. Anybody have any question to ask at all? Yes, please, Jim.
I would like to ask Bill. Last night I turned on cable and I happened to catch the last part of For Justice for All. How do you, when you are acting as a defense attorney, and you know for a fact that your client is guilty, but it is your job to get him off, how do you handle that personally?
As a Christian.
As a Christian lawyer.
As a Christian lawyer.
I don't have any problem with that. Having been a prosecutor for almost 4 years and a defense attorney for enough years to get all this gray hair, you first of all have to understand the system. The way the system best functions is in an adversary way, whereby if two strong forces meet, hopefully somewhere in the middle is that concept of justice. I think that's the first thing you have to understand. The second thing you have to understand is what is your role in the system? Are you judge? Are you jury? Are you defense counsel? Are you prosecutor? And each one has a different role. Much the same as if you're going to go out on a soccer field and start playing football. The rules and the game comes unglued. All right. It is about the best system, our democratic system of justice, that I've found in the world. It's far from perfect, and we have to admit that. A couple of fundamental rules. Number one, you can never participate in perjury or the concept of subornation of perjury, because that's a crime. And so often, and I've dealt with a number of drug cases, for instance, you have to initially look at the mental health issues again. There are cases where if I got a young person off, I would do them the greatest disservice in the world, because they'd go out on the street and deal again and get involved in an addiction. So your role in that type of case oftentimes is to be frontline mental health and get them help. And in that type of case, my first message to them, you're in the wrong office if you just want somebody to get you out of your predicament. But if you want to turn your life around, and you want to start dealing with root cause issues, and you want to seek a decent life, then I'll be delighted to help. I will only do that if you start helping yourself. Now, in terms of, let's say, a murder case, where I've tried a number of murder cases and been involved in them, the system allows you to defend someone very legitimately, provided they don't commit perjury and you don't participate in it. For example, you are innocent in this country and in England and in our system until proven guilty. It is not your duty to defend yourself until the Commonwealth, the government, has proven you guilty. The communist system is exactly the opposite. You are presumed guilty when you walk into the court system. The Gang of Four that are being tried in China now, they've already been convicted, regardless of what the facts are. They've been convicted because the system has put them on trial. And the only question now is meting out the punishment. I've always felt it is much better to allow some potentially quote-unquote guilty people walk out than to try, convict, and electrocute an innocent person. And I very seriously mean that. Our system has a great deal of safeguards, and very seldom does that happen. But it has happened, and we would be frank to admit that. It has happened oftentimes in certain parts of our country, in certain socioeconomic groups, and in certain ethnic groups, whereby, by virtue of the color of their skin, the pronunciation of their last name, that they are guilty before they're ever tried. That's a long-winded answer to the question, but I think it is a very, very complicated issue. I think it's an emotionally inflaming issue. I think you can say the system is wrong wherever you defend anybody that is guilty. But I say to you, guilty of what? A friend of mine is president of the Bermuda Bar Association, where there are 55,000 people on that island. Their system works the way ours did 100 years ago. When you are tried for a crime in Bermuda, somebody on every jury knows you. And as he said, you aren't tried for that crime. You're on trial based on what your peers think about you, know about you, your living, your Christian or non-Christian walk, what kind of human being you are. And maybe that's really what you should be on trial for. The difficulty is that the agrarian society that our system of jurisprudence grew out of is gone. Today, if a juror knows the defendant, he's struck from the panel. He's struck from the jury, which I think is wrong. I think it would be far better if your peers truly knew who they were judging. And if you're a bad hombre, maybe you belong extricated from society under those circumstances. But if you've lived an exemplary life, and all of us are capable of goofing once, then maybe that should be taken into account. Maybe that's real justice.
Anyone else?
On your comments about ERA and the effect on the family, I, for one, am a little tired of everywhere that I go when I hear someone speak about ERA to make a negative comment about it. I think when you say ERA includes a lot of things. And when you make a negative comment about it, I think you put a damper on all the positive things. I think if it was left for men to change women's situation in this country, they'd still be waiting for the right to vote. And I think the fact that they are vocal, and I think that the positive things that they have done for it are put down when you only make a negative comment about one fact of what it might be doing. And I think it should, if you're going to comment on it, say, this is one part of ERA that I disagree with, not use ERA in general.
Just one thing. I don't want any other questions on ERA. It's a hot issue that would go for 2 days. If you're interested in that, write it on your card. And I mean that very seriously. I got into one of these, and it's very hot. I think there's a very Christian position in ERA, and I think Bill needs to answer that particular. Will you make sure that that microphone's passed back, please?
I believe that you didn't hear everything I said, because I said this new divorce code came because of forces coming in opposite directions. I didn't spell it out in detail, but certainly ERA was one of the positive forces that wrought change in the domestic relations law in the state of Pennsylvania. That's what I mean by those conflicting forces. I also talked about male lib, which is a equal force in the opposite direction. I also indicated that I was making some generalizations, and in the short period of time that I spoke, I had to do that to make some points. And I think your point is extremely well taken.
Thank you. Betty, at the end there.
I would like to ask Paul if he would just very briefly just give us brief information about the Today program with which he's working, because I think there are people here who have members of their family who would need to know this. And apart from that, I think it's valuable information for us all to have, because we come in contact with people who would need this information. And if Paul could just tell us very briefly what the Today program is and how it is available for the community to use.
Okay, then this turns out to be my second commercial. Well, Today Incorporated is a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center here in Bucks County that is about 10 years old now. We deal specifically with 14 to 22-year-olds in our residential program and 15 to 30-year-olds in our outpatient program. It's an attempt to, number one, deal with the issue of drug and alcohol addiction. But it's in a larger sense, the issue is much greater than that. The position that we essentially take is that behind the addiction is an irresponsible individual. That's not so much a judgment as in fact as it is a fact. If you look at people who are destructively involved in drug and alcohol abuse, they're manifesting irresponsible lives. So our attempt is, number one, to deal with the drug and alcohol abuse. Number two, to deal with restructuring the life so that a person becomes responsible in terms of a job, responsible in terms of family, responsible in terms of school, whatever. So that in that sense, we're a very comprehensive program. We work across the full range of forces that brought a young person destructively to deal with drugs or alcohol. Just as a postscript to that, if I had to categorize the person who essentially comes to us, particularly in need of residential treatment, it's a person who is a person without hope. Somewhere at the age of 15 or 16 or 17, you or I took a look at life, and we essentially, for whatever forces came into play, believed that we could make it in our own small way. And so we looked at life positively. Most of the people who become involved in drug and alcohol abuse that we see are people who took a look at life at age 15 or 16 and for some reason concluded they couldn't make it. So I add that as a postscript because I think what today is really about is an agency of hope. What we do is we give people hope, we give them a sense of personal esteem so that when they take a look at life again, when they complete our program, they believe and they feel that they can make it.
Thank you, Paul. Anybody?
When I say anything, I usually put them on the spot, and Paul, you've been chosen. The people who are in today, the youngsters that come to you, would you say that many of them belong to Christian families or not?
That's a difficult question to answer. Because I think it goes back to the kind of thing that George Gallup was talking about. We determine at intake, like we find out somebody's age and we find out what the color of their hair is, all of those kind of questions. Another question at intake is a person, what is their religious preference? Okay. Most people on that put down a religious preference. Very few people, in fact, that come to see us do not put down a religious preference. when you ask the question, are they practicing? Most people put down that they're non-practicing with regard to that religious preference. Now, as to whether or not their families are practicing, I don't know, because we don't ask the question. And I really don't want, in this context, to make that kind of judgment. I think the issue is the issue that I suggested Dr. Gallup indicated to me, and that is that you have to look behind what a person says and take a look at not only what they're practicing, but whether what they do in terms of community matches their belief. Yeah, we work now with families, pretty directly at the level of increasing communication, of providing support, of determining love, both in terms of nurture and discipline. But I'm not sure that I want to make a judgment as to whether or not a family is a Christian family or a practicing family. In some cases, I just don't have that information, because that's not the level of the information that we seek. In some cases, I think, as I indicated on the blackboard, there's a lot of there are families where everything seems to be in place, except for some reason one member of that family, in this case the kid, doesn't perceive it.
Alan, having been involved in Today for some 10 years, I think I can make these observations, having represented a number of the families and the kids. The use of drugs oftentimes is a false spiritual experience. It's seeking and taking a substitute. I have said many times, and I truly believe it, I have never met a hardcore drug addict who has a true personal relationship with Jesus Christ.
May I add? No, you're out now. We've got to go on to another question.
That's my question.
Oh, well, those are the breaks. You get your money back after. May I go back to the wheel that we had on the board? I really think one of the biggest problems I see in Jesus Focus is where families are out of balance with freedom and control. I believe that you're learning love. I feel it in Jesus Focus from you. But when I find problems are coming with your children, some of you are overdoing the control and doing too much on the freedom, and others are vice versa. And it's keeping those two in balance that is the Christian's problem. And I think I can go a step further here and say those of you who are sensitive to the Holy Spirit will begin to learn how much freedom and how much control. But know this, and I've said it many times, the Bible tells you to discipline, and God holds you responsible. Joan Miller, third row, third one in.
Proposition 13. I would like to have your opinion on it and how it would involve the Christians. I mean, because I've heard a lot of pros and cons about it.
Proposition 13, I'm sure all of you understand it. When we talk about that conceptually, that was the taxpayers' revolt in California, in which they basically said, and they voted to cut a number of the governmental delivery aspects to society, and to therefore cut a lot of human service programs. Interestingly enough, I have a brother-in-law who works in the human services system in California, and some very positive things have come out of it. A number of so-called programs that were really not delivering what they should have fallen by the wayside. In many instances, the stronger ones have survived, and there's been a reorientation. We recognize, and we spent the morning on certain issues such as there are not going to be the dollars to throw at the human service delivery system. We're going to have to reorient our priorities. We're going to have to reinstitute the use of volunteers. A very exciting thing, I think, happened yesterday. I talked to the director of the Pine Run community, the adult community up next to the shrine. And he said, we have a wealth of adult people up there that just are hankering to help, and we haven't tapped them. And I think we've got to reorient the use of volunteers, and I think that's one of the commitments of the 80s. And so I think there are some very positive things out of Proposition 13. I think that some extremely conservative, some people who really do not care about their fellow man, and I don't put them in the same category, can use this as a cop-out. And I think we've got to watch that.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I'd like to address my question to Mr. Eastburn. A quick two-part question. Not having to deal with lawyers or having any problems, the Lord's been good to me, my family. If I need a lawyer in a hurry, and anything can happen these days with reference to kids, anybody, how do I get to a lawyer? If I have to get to a lawyer in 5 minutes without having the police or somebody else, whoever it might be, mishandle the situation, I get a fair treatment through a lawyer. How do I get to a lawyer, a Christian lawyer, that's going to give me the right kind of a concern? How do I get in touch with them? I know there's a referral service of lawyers, but that can catch me anything, as talking about shingles being hung out. So whereas maybe a more higher salary group will have access to better lawyers, etc. That's my first question. How do I get to a reliable Christian lawyer? These may be known to some. The second question is, I've seen some examples of public defenders. Is it true, win, lose, or draw the case, they get paid the same amount? Do you get the same quality of justice, the same concern with that type of lawyer? That's my second question.
Try the second one first. He's talking about the public defenders. It is a training ground for young lawyers. They work for the government. They are on a salary, the same as assistant district attorneys. Some very fine lawyers come through that system. I say that advisedly, but I was an assistant district attorney. I know some quality lawyers that trained in the system by being on the front lines. Initially, there is no question that they are learning at the expense of their client. But it is affording a defense to some people that couldn't afford it. So it's better than what was heretofore existing, especially in some states where in Florida or Alabama, you might be black and be on trial for your life and have no counsel whatsoever. And the Supreme Court says that's wrong. Now, the problem is the pendulum swings back and forth from liberal to conservative on some of these issues, and they get to be hot political and emotional issues. I don't think I can say any more than that. In terms of your first question, I'm not going to give you a commercial, but I am going to say to you that I think groups such as Jesus Focus and other church groups have somewhat of responsibility in this day of consumerism to go out and seek out Christian paper hangers, painters, doctors, lawyers, and have a referral service. The bar associations of the various and sundry communities, you can call them and they will give you a lawyer referral at no cost to you to get to see the lawyer at a very low cost for the first half hour, and we all serve in that program. That does not necessarily get you a Christian lawyer. I know that Jesus Focus has a referral system, and I think that that's the type of thing that you should demand when you commit yourself in a group like this.